Long-distance cruising sailors may seem to be an odd choice of guest for a green interview, but in fact hardly anyone leaves a smaller ecological footprint. An ocean-crossing sailboat has to be self-sufficient for weeks on end, conserving water, generating its own electricity, often doing without refrigeration, traveling between continents using no fossil fuel at all. Even within these stringent circumstances, of course, there are wastrels and conservers, and the most famous cruising conserver, hands down, is Annie Hill, author of Voyaging on a Small Income, who has spent her entire adult life living richly and inexpensively at sea and in ports from Greenland to New Zealand, from Africa to Australia. She lived and cruised for years on an income of less than $50 a week. Annie Hill is the consummate anti-consumer, a subversive philosopher who has become famous not merely for her astonishing fund of nautical experience, but also as an exemplar of the rich and free lifestyle which an ordinary person can achieve. For Annie, the key to a good life is freedom. The key to freedom is good financial management, and reducing one's expenditures is easier and less entangling than increasing one's income. You choose sailing, or art, or religion, or good works, not as a supplement to a consumerist life cluttered with possessions, but as an alternative to such a life. Her husband, Trevor Robertson, shares her values and has also spent almost all his life cruising on a steel sailboat named Ironbark, which he built himself in his native Australia. He is the only cruiser in history to have overwintered, frozen in the ice, in both the Arctic and the Antarctic, and in the same boat. Between them, Annie and Trevor have sailed more than 300,000 ocean miles. They were married in Nova Scotia in 2003, and in 2010 they were jointly awarded the highest accolade in the sailing world, the Blue Water Medal of the Cruising Club of America. A truly sustainable lifestyle will require that we in the developed world learn to live on a great deal less. Annie and Trevor show us that it can be done, and that we can live very rich lives while demanding very little from the earth. Welcome, and thank you very much for doing this. You've defined voyaging as sailing as a continuing way of life, and your true vocation as traveling over the world's seas. Haven't had a home ashore since you were 18 or 19. How did you come to adapt this sea gypsy lifestyle?
The way that most women probably do, I met a man with a boat. And he had built the boat with a plan of sailing the single-handed transatlantic race, and with most boats it didn't actually get finished when it should have got finished. So the single-handed transatlantic race had been and gone, and the boat was eventually launched, and he really wasn't happy working and wanted to go and sail around the world, effectively. And I'd come into his life, so he sort of more or less said to me, shall we sail across the Atlantic? And so I was in a state of blissful ignorance, so I said yes.
And what was that like? You're like 18 or 19, right? Never had anything much to do with boats before?
No.
How helped him to finish the boat, though?
I got in just at this tail end, and I sort of wielded a paintbrush once or twice. And then we had a summer weekend sailing together. And I remember the first trip that I did on the boat was it was launched in the west coast of England, which is very tidal, in a little creek, and we had to leave to catch the tide and then take the tide down and then go back on the next tide to where our mooring was. Well, this adventure started about 4 in the morning in the pitch dark, and the boat had no engine. And and in the west coast of England, once you leave the harbour vanishes. So once you're out, you're out. So we went down this river and came out to sea, and then went up the next river to where we were going to leave the boat, and that was my first experience under sail. And the second passage of any time we did was overnight, 100-mile passage. So I was sort of thrown in at the deep end and assumed this was the normal thing to do.
Didn't occur to you to be other than accepting of it?
Absolutely not, no. I mean, I was so incredibly ignorant that I had no idea that this isn't what people did.
But didn't you rather surprise him by suggesting that you go to the West Indies in that boat? That he wasn't expecting to do that?
Well, what it was we were sitting rather glumly one night, sort of trying to decide what we were going to do with the rest of our lives, which seemed to involve things like houses and jobs and all that sort of thing. And neither of us is terribly keen on jobs business, and houses need jobs. And even then I knew I didn't really like working. And so I said to people, well, what do you want to do? And he said, well, what I really want to do is just get into Stormalong and sail across the Atlantic. So I said, well, why don't we do it? And he said, well, we could. So I said, well, why don't we? And so it seemed perfectly, if Pete thought we could sail across the Atlantic, then obviously we could sail across the Atlantic. This is perfectly rational to me, really.
And you did, in this
and we did.
Quite small, quite light catamaran.
Yes, and I had to go home and get out Daddy's atlas and look where the West Indies was, because I really didn't know. I was very ignorant.
But the voyage was quite successful.
It was. We dismasted twice. And we had the about 2 days out from the Canaries on a 28-day crossing of the Atlantic. We were hit by a rather large wave that came down the dorade box and flooded the bunk that we slept on. So we had a wet bed all the way across the Atlantic.
But you're young and in love and you think it's groovy, right?
Yes, absolutely. And nobody who seemed to know anything about boats had told me differently. So, and in those days, people were sailing small boats a lot more. In the fleet at the time, there were a couple of folk boats and a Hurley 22, and there was a 30-foot tiny little trimaran, and I think people were possibly more adventurous. They're certainly poorer, so they had to have smaller boats.
Yeah. And simpler boats too.
Oh, much simpler.
Yeah.
Yes.
But then you decided after that this was not the boat that you wanted to stay in. And
well, really, it was too small. I mean, the hulls were 18 inches wide at the wide point, and the double bunk was 12 inches wide at the wide point. And tapered down to about that at the foot. And I mean, there wasn't really sitting headroom, let alone standing headroom. And it really wasn't feasible to consider living on the boat in England. And we did need to, when we got back to England, we had £5 left, so we really needed to earn some money to carry on with the rest of our lives. So the plan was to build another boat. Well, that didn't work out for a number of reasons. Essentially, Pete was over-ambitious in his concept of what was feasible. So we scrapped that idea and we went and bought a 1921 ex-racing boat, and we lived on that for a while. But she really wasn't suitable for what we wanted to do. So one day we just said, look, sort ourselves out and build a proper boat and that we can go sailing with forever.
And that's really where the beginning, or part of the beginning of your sort of philosophy of cruising and philosophy of life begins, right? Because really early on, even then, you were sort of saying you wanted to find a way to live on investment income, not on earnings.
That's right.
And to be able to basically do what you wanted to do, which was sail full time.
Yes,
right?
And I was helped immensely because Pete was frugal to a fault. And his favourite phrase at the moment is, "It's green to be mean." And so he didn't like spending money, and I didn't like acquiring it. So it was a pretty good team, really. And he didn't like acquiring it very much either.
So you wound up living on the one boat while building the other?
Yes,
do I remember that correctly?
That's right, yes.
And so no rent to pay while you're living on the
Well,
one
apart
boat.
from the fact that we were in a marina, so we had to pay the marina fees, which is the equivalent of a rent.
But much less.
I would think so. I don't know.
Yeah. And so you've got and then the boat you built is the boat that subsequently you made famous, which is Badger, the junk-rigged schooner.
Yes.
And what were the things that you needed to have in that boat? That was a very cleverly designed and very carefully thought out boat. What were the features that were really important to you in that boat?
In no particular order. Of course, she had to be seaworthy. She had to be beautiful as far as we were concerned anyway. And the practical things, starting from the outside, were things like ease of maintenance and durability. And inside, we wanted a separate sleeping cabin. We wanted a comfortable saloon that worked on both tacks, whereas with a dinette you can only sit comfortably on one tack. And it had to have a big galley because I like cooking, and as well, if you making your money go as far as possible, you need to do a lot of cooking. And a separate heads compartment and a lot of stowage so that we could carry all our worldly goods and be able to stock up on bargains when we came across them.
And that's way more important than it seems at first glance, right?
Oh, yes.
A big piece of your approach to all of this was to buy when the buying was good and not to buy when the buying was expensive.
Exactly. And also the object of the exercise was not only to live cheaply, but to live at the best possible standard cheaply. I mean, it's easy to live cheaply, but to live at a high standard, surround yourself with beautiful things, own a beautiful boat, even knives and forks and things, to me, should be beautiful because you're using them every day. So they have to be pleasing to the eye, otherwise it diminishes your life, really. So yes, if you go somewhere and, well, of course, typical thing would be cheap wine in the Spain or the Canaries. You stock up with that, and then when you go somewhere else where you can't afford to have wine, you can still enjoy having the wine. All sorts of things like that. I mean, things like, I don't know, tubes of tomato puree. They're only available in some places, and they're more economical than little tins of tomato puree, and we didn't have a refrigerator, so once something was open it would go off. So you'd think, right, we'll get 20 of those because that'll keep us going for ages until we can get somewhere else where we can buy them again.
So basically a very frugal lifestyle, but that took advantage of the opportunities as they came along.
Yes.
And because you're traveling, you're finding different opportunities all the time, right?
That's right. Yeah. And you're also coming across new things all the time. I mean, just day-to-day things, new foods to eat, and new ways of doing things, and different ways of doing things. Yeah.
But all of this depends on at least some cash.
Ideally, well, yes. I mean, sadly, in this world, we need money. Yes.
And you had figured out a way to actually live off investment income, and you had no money, nothing to invest in the first place.
Yes,
so
which is quite clever, really, wasn't it? I'm not quite sure how we managed it, really. We were living on Sheila, and we were both working while we were building the boat, because obviously had to get money to build the boat. And neither of us had particularly good jobs, but one of the things we didn't have was a motor car because they're fearsomely expensive to run. And because we were working, we didn't have any spare time either, so that, we didn't need to bother about going to the movies or the pub or anything of that ilk. And what we did essentially was to build the boat on the money Pete was earning, and then we saved as much as we could from the money I was earning, and then we sold Sheila. But I mean, we sold Sheila for about, £5,000. It wasn't a lot, but in a way we were spectacularly lucky, because although we lived in a world where there were very few jobs, which is why we didn't have particularly good jobs, and there had been quite high inflation, so the interest rates were very high, and we found some government stocks that were undated and high interest, 10% interest. So we bought those whenever we could, and that gave us, by the time we launched Badger, we had enough to give us £15 a week, and we sailed over to the West Indies, and we worked 2 winters. I was working as a cocktail waitress, and Pete worked as a charter skipper, and also rode around collecting garbage at $1 a bag, which and in those days a US dollar was worth nearly a pound sterling. So we carried on living on the £15 a week, and we sent all this extra money back and bought more of these government stocks. And by the time we'd done that, we actually had an income that would give us £25 a week. It actually gave us about 28 or 29, and we chose 25. And then every year, of course, we were making more than we were earning. We were earning more than we were spending, so it grew every year, which allowed us to give ourselves a pay rise in 1995. So we lived from 1984 to 1995 at £25 a week.
£25 a week,
Yeah.
which is, let us say,
40 Canadian?
Yeah, $40.
In those days,
$40
plus
a
or
week.
minus, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and which even then was not a lot of money.
No, it was not a lot of money at all.
But with owning the boat already, so you have no rent.
I had
to
no
pay.
debts.
Tell me about the other things that you didn't have to have because you were on a boat.
Well, we didn't need a car, of course,
Right, yeah.
or any form of transport apart from a dinghy. Well, we didn't have a fridge or TV, or what else would people have had in those days? Well, we didn't have any toys really. So, which I think all of those are expensive. They all not necessarily individually, but added together, you can easily hemorrhage money if you're fitting out a house. Carpets and furniture and kettles and all the rest of it. It adds up to a fantastic amount of money, I should think.
Yeah, and that's all built in.
That's essentially all built in, yes.
Or it's either built in or eliminated. One
Yes,
or the other,
that's right.
And, which is, yeah. But you were also a very frugal cook, as I
Yes,
recall it.
well, that was another.
You weren't eating expensive
No.
cuts of meat or anything like that.
Well, I went vegetarian in 1979. I'd always been interested in it for as long as I could remember, really. Largely because I like animals, I suppose. But I was brought up in a family that ate meat as, sort of instead of meat and two veg, it was more like two meat and veg. So the whole household was very meat oriented. So and my mother was a good cook, but not a frugal cook. So I was used to great slabs of meat on the plate, and that's what he'd hacked into, and we couldn't afford it. I simply couldn't afford it. And because I really didn't know anything about cooking, I didn't know how to get all these much vaunted cheap cuts and make wonderful stews out of scrag end and neck and all the rest of it. So I thought, we can't afford to eat. So I thought, well, let's have an idea, look at this vegetarian idea, because if you cut out meat, you're going to cut out the major cost. And vegetarianism was still pretty outre then. And I came across a book called The Bean Book, which was, as it turned out, just one of many that this particular cook had written, the cookery writer had written. And this Bean Book sort of changed our lives, because a lot of vegetarian food, particularly in those days, the cookery books were from America, and America has a very different way of eating anyway, and a lot of the ingredients simply weren't available, because we're talking a long time ago now. But this book was written by an English person, so all the stuff was available, and this was just before we started building badgers, so we were based in the UK at the time, and it was incredibly cheap, and it was filling, and Pete was a little thin bloke, but he ate like a horse. So he could be quite expensive to feed. Yeah. So that in a way did revolutionise our lives, because that got rid of one of our major costs, which was food. We cut it right down, and then you'd sort of shop around and compare. Right, I could have a cabbage or I could have Brussels sprouts. The cabbage is much better value per pound than the Brussels sprouts, so we had the cabbage. And yes, it was just almost doing cost-benefit analysis really on everything.
And you're reflecting on this stuff all the time. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, you didn't set out to develop a philosophy of
Not in the slightest, no.
No, of voluntary simplicity, but it emerges from basically looking at these sorts of questions, finding the answers that work, and then sort of saying, how does this all fit together?
Yeah, right? Trying to avoid work and trying to enjoy life. Yes.
Now, so during this what we might think of as the Badger period.
Yes.
The two of you worked relatively few weeks a year, right?
Oh, yes, hardly at all. Yes. After launching Badger, well, we did this work in the West Indies for 3 months, or perhaps 5 months for 2 seasons, but that was part-time work anyway. And then we went up to the States, and we helped a friend finish fitting out his boat, and he paid us. I probably shouldn't tell you this, I'm sure it's all illegal, but he paid us regular wages really for 2 people to work a 40-hour week. So all that went back to England too. And then after that, when was the next time we worked? Next time we worked was my father was ill in England, and he had terminal cancer. So you can't really sort of say, well, we've come home to see Dad die, which is what the truth of it. So we said, well, you know, we needed some work anyway, so we came back. And each of us managed to hack it about 10 months before we gave up and went sailing. And in that time we bought a little 20-foot boat and we converted that to junk rig. And we went off in the spring and spent 3 months in and out of the Brittany canals. Oh. And then we sold that boat for a wee profit, which went in the bank. And then
where's Badger at this point?
Oh, we were living on her in Falmouth in England.
Oh, okay. And so you bought this little one in addition to
In addition to. She was known as Baby Badger because we painted in the same livery and she had the little junk rig on and she was a full width cabin like Badger too. She was cute as. Yeah. And we when my poor dad eventually did pass away, we left England, so that would be 1989, and well, we didn't work again after that.
Now, where did you go in Badger?
Oh, well, largely up and down the Atlantic, about as far north as Baffinland and as far south as the South Orkney Islands in the Antarctic, and Brazil, a bit of the Mediterranean. We never got on with the Med. We poked our nose in twice and came out again.
And what was wrong with the Med?
I think it was pretty awful sailing there. It's a bit all or nothing. I think it was probably just too crowded. I don't know. It was perhaps it was too close to home even. It wasn't very adventurous. Just didn't turn us on really. Yeah. Yeah.
That's kind of what I suspected when you said that. I thought to myself, no, these are people who like to go to Baffinland and South Orkney Islands. Yeah. They probably are going to find, Ibiza a little bit stale, right? A little bit tame.
Yes. Yeah. Ibiza is quite nice actually. Yeah. But yes, we sort of didn't set out to do a lot of high latitude stuff. I mean, we really enjoyed Nova Scotia, which isn't high latitude, or Ireland. But I think the Med was just. It was expensive. It was often quite expensive. There's a shortage of good anchorages in lots of it, and the marinas vary from relatively cheap to horrendously expensive. Mm-hmm. But there was unsatisfactory sailing and a lot of yachts around too. I guess
one of the things that's so striking to me about this whole thing is the. You couldn't have planned it better, and yet I'm sure it wasn't exactly planned except step by step, but you wind up building your own boat, and she's a very satisfactory boat. In fact, she has inspired dozens of copies, right? And all kinds of other people have now built junk rig schooners like Badger, and then you've sailed her to all kinds of interesting places, many of which are, and particularly then, were well off the beaten track.
Yes.
So you've been able to have a very adventurous lifestyle, and you've done all of this living on the proceeds of capital which you didn't have when you started.
It's a bit like that, isn't it? Yes.
And it's an extraordinary achievement in sort of getting the most out of your time and your life and your world. It seems.
Yes, I mean, for somebody who is something of a pinko, and Pete and I were both superficially regarded as a pair of hippies. We're both hard-nosed capitalists when it comes down to it.
Well, very efficient hippies too. So a couple of other things about the actual process. I'm sure some people are going to wonder, if you don't have much in the way of electricity, where do you get the bit of electricity you do get? How do you spend it, and how do you preserve food in the absence of refrigeration, which is
well, of course, one of the things is if you don't need meat, you don't need much in the way of refrigeration. And quite a lot of the other things that go into a fridge are expensive, so you can't afford to buy them anyway, like greens in the tropics and so forth. I mean, salad greens, and you just I suppose really you buy things and really watch them and see what happens to them, see what they like and what they don't like. I mean, for example, in the tropics, if it were cheap, which it was in many places, I could buy a lettuce. And I could keep that lettuce for nearly a week, because what I'd do is I would nurture it in an open plastic bag. The lettuce would never be washed until I came to eat it, and I'd pick out one leaf at a time round the edge, and it wouldn't rot and die on you if you cherished it and looked after it. Whereas other things like the fat water-filled cucumber, I mean, there's no way you could keep that because the water in it just got so warm it almost essentially cooked the vegetable, so that wouldn't work. And you get citrus, and what goes wrong with citrus? Well, it gets mouldy. Okay, so if we could stop it going mouldy, we could keep the citrus longer. So try washing it in bleach and see what happens. Okay, you get a lot less mould. Great. So just thinking about it and looking at things and remembering what's happened.
Yes, yes. And some of this is traditional anyway, isn't it? I mean, some
Quite
of this
a lot of
knowledge
it, yes.
that we used to have.
Yeah,
as
great
a
grandma
culture.
could have taught me a few things if I'd had a great grandma to talk to.
Yeah.
And I did try putting stuff up in jars, but it seemed to be more trouble than it was worth. Really, we could always keep fresh. I mean, we never ran out of fresh food, and
some people do a lot of that. I think some cruising people do a lot of canning and in that sense.
A lot of women tend to obsess on the catering side because the whole of the rest of it is his idea, and she doesn't understand it. The one thing she does understand is she's going to have to feed them, and they do tend to get really obsessive about it, and then they can only eat what they used to. So the cheese whiz has to go on board, or if you're English, the Marmite has to go on board.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, well, I'm sure when we get to Brazil, they'll have something equally interesting to put on bread. Let's see what they have.
Yes, and the Brazilians eat. They have.
Yes, that's right.
There are things people can eat there, even if they're not what you're used to. But that takes the adventurous spirit again, doesn't it? You have to be willing to be open and willing to change your habits a little bit as you go.
I think so. But again, being a vegetarian is a great assistance because a bean looks like a bean.
Yes.
Whereas a bit of dead meat hanging up on a hook could be not only from any part of the animal, but from any animal, really.
Yes.
So if you go into a country where you don't speak the language and you go into a meat market, which in many countries is an extremely unpleasant experience, and you point to a piece of meat, you've really no idea what you're buying.
Yes.
Whereas, say, if you point to a bean, you know what a bean is. So you're probably far more adventurous if you do eat meat than if you don't.
And that probably relates to the canning thing, because I think that largely what people can is meat, isn't it?
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
And I think I probably scared the wits out of myself anyway, because I had a book on putting food by and had all these dire warnings about botulism and all the rest of it. And I think in the end I thought, this is too frightening anyway.
Yeah. Even among cruising sailors, you're unusual in that your cruising is permanent. It's not a parenthesis in a life that's being lived elsewhere. But you've spoken to a lot of cruising people, and you've done some research on other cruising people. What can we say generally about the cost of people living for long periods of time on a sailboat?
It'll cost them as much as they have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I call the book Voyaging on a Small Income is everyone thinks they have a small income, and whether you're on £25 a week or £250 a week, you're always budgeting to that. So if you've got X amount of money to spend, that's what you'll spend. If you've got 10x amount of money to spend, you'll spend that too. So it's just like living ashore, really. It takes as much as you've got.
Yes. Alternatively, you spend what you've got. I mean, so in a sense, the secret, your secret, if we could call it that, is Mr. Macawber's secret.
Absolutely, no, totally. That is my philosophy in life. 19 and 6, income 20 shillings, expenditure 19 and 6, result happiness. Income 20 shillings, expenditure 20 shillings and 6pence, result misery. And that is totally my philosophy. And I've always put some money aside. I've never lived up to my income. I can't do that.
And it works. That can work for everybody. That can work. That isn't just a secret for living on a boat.
No, and I think that's why a lot of people who have been past my book, who don't sail, still enjoy it, because it is saying what it's really saying is, hey, if you want to do something, you can do it, and it doesn't need to be expensive. You just need to get your head around the fact that you can do it, and then go out and do it.
Now, one of the things that's come out of this after all these years, and it is quite a few years now that you've been doing this, but at the start of it, you basically are trying to figure out a way to go sailing for a long period of time without the intrusion of having to earn money.
Correct.
That's really
that's
really is the
That's
objective.
it in a nutshell, yes.
Then you discover that you've actually got a kind of a philosophy of living that's developed out of that. And by the time you get to 2011, you've become a model green citizen, because your footprint has to be very, very small, doesn't it?
I think so, yes. Yeah, it is. I mean, I was listening to something on the radio the other day about these really sort of cool and green people who are living in houses of 25 cubic meters. And you know, how amazing is this? And I tried to work out the cubic meterage of the boat that I was living in, but I mean, you know, 2, 3, something like that, you know, I mean, nothing like 25 cubic meters. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah. And you use practically no fossil fuels, a little bit of diesel now and then. But
yeah, I use a little bit of diesel to run my engine, and heat with wood. And
you don't have any shore transportation other than a bicycle?
I have a bicycle, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I use public transport occasionally, not very often. Yeah.
I should explain to people here that you and Pete and Badger went your separate ways at one point, and that you're now living on a smaller boat in New Zealand, married to Trevor Robertson, and the two of you are sometimes sailing together and sometimes living on 2 boats separately.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
And yes, I'm in my little boat in New Zealand. If you sort of think of as a green lifestyle, it must be pretty green, really, compared with how most people live. But I mean, one of the advantages of living in a really, really small space is well, I mean, that's why they call it a footprint, isn't it? I mean, it's much easier to heat it or to clean it. I mean, even if you were to take a vacuum around, the difference between vacuuming a very small place and vacuuming a very big place is going to use more resources. And if I were ever to have a house, which is pretty inconceivable, but if I were, I'd want it to be about the size of this boat shed, really. Not much bigger. Yeah. I can't imagine living in a large house ashore.
It's fascinating, and this is why I wanted to do a green interview with you, because in a sense, I think when most people in the developed world think about the sacrifices, quote, quote, or think about the change in lifestyle that would be required to get us all down into a footprint that the Earth could stand, they think of themselves as being greatly impoverished. You know,
absolutely.
And do you think of yourself as poor?
No, I'm one of the wealthiest people in the world.
So what's wealth?
Being able to sit out in the sun and enjoy it, eh?
Yeah.
Being in control of your own life. I mean, I've got food, I've got shelter, I've got freedom. I mean, you know, I'm one of the luckiest people on earth.
At this point in my conversation with Annie Hill, we were joined by her husband, Trevor Robertson. Trevor and Annie, are there things that you miss that other people have ashore? Are there times when you come ashore and think, gee, I wish I had the use of X, Y, or Z that just isn't possible given your lifestyle?
Access to the internet for information, I think, is probably the biggest. And decent libraries. Well, if you've got the internet, you don't really need a decent library, I suppose.
Right. But access to information, I guess.
Yeah, access to information,
Annie,
yeah.
I hadn't thought of that one, actually. Yes, that's a point.
Yes.
And hot showers are a good idea.
But you
can live without them.
No, you can make a plan around hot showers. You can't make a plan about lack of a library.
I remember with our mutual friends, the Bonzis, saying that what they wanted was an anchorage with perfect seclusion, excellent internet access, and a ready supply of aubergine.
That sounds pretty good.
A washing machine would probably be quite a useful addition to that as well.
Yes, washing machines are good.
Yes, but I really don't mind washing in a stream.
No, but I'm thinking about this from the perspective of someone watching who's thinking, well, I don't know if I could live that way, and I'm curious to know, after having basically trained yourself into this over a long period of time, if there are still things that you look at from time to time and think, yep, that's part of the price of doing this, worth doing, but that's part of the price.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the internet access is certainly in that.
And of course that's a new phenomenon too, that it wasn't an issue 30 years ago. And I suspect in 30 years' time it will be readily accessible on boats at an affordable price too.
I suspect it will be, yeah.
Possibly not in 30 years even.
Possibly
Yes,
not.
yes. Well, probably, yeah. Satellite access to it is probably not very far away, and
It's there, it's just not affordable on our sorts of budgets.
yeah, yeah. Another one that I think people often wonder is about whether or not you feel confined. And you're on a 35-foot world or thereabouts, and you're on it for long periods of time, and you're on it together, which can't always. Being in a much larger house isn't always easy for most of us to be with. How do you manage that kind of thing, or what kinds of issues does that give rise to?
The horizon's a long way away. I've only ever felt confined in harbour.
Yes, I don't.
Never felt confined at sea, but I have felt confined in harbour on occasion.
I don't think I've ever felt confined at all on a boat.
Oh, yes, sometimes if you're in a tight, and all you can see is sea walls and other boats, it feels a little bit claustrophobic. But no, that's the nearest it's ever happened to us, I think.
But if that's the case, then aren't you essentially seeing the world as if you were the boat?
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, you're not seeing this as a person on a boat, you're seeing it as the boat. The boat is confined in the seawall situation, right? And the boat has all the way to the horizon to go, so it's not confined. Is that actually the way you feel?
I never thought of it that way, but it's probably not a bad way of phrasing it.
It sounds ridiculous for somebody who lives like me, but I'm actually a real homebody, so I love being at home.
And if home happens to be small?
That's better, isn't it? Yes, you're really at home then.
What about the situation when one of you gets irritated with the other one, and when we're a couple ashore, somebody might stomp off to the pub or go to his workshop and storm away at pieces of wood or something? How do you deal with that sort of thing?
Stomp off the forecabin. Okay, I'll best back off for a bit.
I don't know how people live in relationships in houses, because I've never lived with anybody in a house, so I don't know if it's more or less difficult on a boat.
But on a boat, is it the same sort of thing that Trevor's described, whereas you just simply go to opposite ends of the boat for a bit?
I think it's more a metaphysical retirement than a physical retirement.
Yes, you pull the blind down.
Yeah.
But it's a mental blind.
Yeah, okay. So you kind of establish your own little territory that you're all going to be alone in, and
go into the galley and make something.
Yeah, poison.
Go on deck and whip
splice a few ropes.
Splice a hangman's noose in the end of the rope or something.
That's probably a very good analogy to, for me, it's always been, go off to the workshop, and do something with wood and so on and so forth.
In Australia, the bloke goes down to his shed when he's in trouble.
Yeah. And so your shed's on deck, and you can go up and do a few useful things up there while you work off and you bring your temperature down. Yeah. Another one that I think both of you, I'd like to know from both of you, is you've both seen the natural world in its natural glory more intimately and more profoundly than almost anyone I know.
Trevor's done even more astonishing things with the winter alone in the Antarctic, so he's been totally
because you're suddenly you are very much part of the landscape, of course. You're just part of one of the floes frozen ashore and watch the circle of the seasons. But your experience in South Georgia and so on.
I think it's a wildlife encounter.
It's a wildlife thing, but also like in Greenland, for instance, the same thing. Although there wasn't a lot of wildlife, watching the full flow of seasons when you're actually part of the landscape, which you're a part of the landscape in a way that you never could be in a house.
I should maybe explain that Ironbark and Trevor are the only boat and man to have been spent the winter frozen into the ice, both in the Antarctic and in the Arctic. And you really were a part. There's some spectacular photographs of that, and of the boat vanished in the ice, more or less. So you are just, in a sense, you're almost like one of the Inuit, right? You're in your little house that really is part of the landscape.
And as well, when Trevor was in the Antarctic, he had no communications, whereas I think that's pretty unusual too.
And in Greenland.
Well, yes, but there were two of us in Greenland, but when you were alone in the Antarctic, you were alone in every sense of it.
You said wildlife is a big piece of this. Tell me about some of the wildlife.
Well, in Antarctica, the penguins are a big part of it, and seals, and the penguins come ashore to start either building or reclaiming last year's nest much earlier than the first ships can break into Antarctica, and so it's very, not many people see that. The seals all get Weddell seals give birth on the ice around the boat. There's not many of them, but around the boat. Again, it's early in the season before the first ships, and they're quite unafraid. And when we were in Greenland, we had a little fox that adopted us, or we adopted it. I'm not sure which way round it was. She'd trot down every morning and sit outside the boat and sort of look interested and watch what was going on. And with a bit of luck, she'd get a small bowl of porridge, which she very much liked.
Yes.
And his little special friend.
My little fox, yes. That was wonderful.
Well, there's a spectacular photograph, Annie, of badger sailing in the lee of an iceberg.
Yes.
Which must have been well, and you must both have had that kind of experience where you're just completely dwarfed by these.
Oh yes. I mean, ice I think is addictive. Once you've sailed amongst ice, you want to go back and do it again.
It's also terrifying.
Oh yes, but
particularly in fog and wind.
yes, not nice then. Not nice then.
Blowing a gale and you can barely see your bowsprit, sort of nonsense.
Yes, but it is incredibly beautiful on a day like today, and it's ever changing. And as well, when I went up north to Baffinland, the close encounters with polar bear was amazing, and one of the things that I'll always be with me.
Do I have a photograph from you of a polar bear swimming by the boat?
You probably do, yes.
I think I do.
Yes.
Yeah. And the water is quite green, and the
Yes,
bear
that
is
was
very
in,
white.
I was in the Button Islands, yes.
Yeah.
And well, we met it ashore, which was a bit of an embarrassment because it was closer to the dinghy than we were. And Pete was he was not very fond of dogs, and tended, if one came bouncing towards us, to put me between the dog and himself. So this polar bear is the only time I've actually seen Pete really frightened. And he wasn't impressed when I said, well, we've got to jump up and down and make a lot of noise and make this thing think we're a lot bigger than we are, and think about it for a few moments. But in the end, he did as I suggested, and the polar bear, sure enough, sort of, okay, backed off a bit to think about it. And we scampered over and got in the dinghy and rowed back to the boat as fast as we could. And then he followed us out and swam around the boat for about half an hour or so.
I wonder what he had in mind, or was he just curious?
Curious, absolutely. What is this? And then he swam over to a sheer cliff face and just walked up the cliff.
We had a similar experience in Northern Labrador. And I'm sure he was just curious. He came out and battered the rudder a few times.
That was quite funny, actually, wasn't it? Because we heard the rudder go, and Trevor said, "What's that?" And I said, "Oh, it's a polar bear." And he said, "It'd be ridiculous." And I just knew it was. And we went out and said, "Trevor, come and have a look." And sure enough, it was a polar bear.
Oh, it's interesting that you talk about fear as being something quite unusual.
No, not for me, for Pete.
But Pete didn't feel it, right? And I get the impression that Trevor's not often fearful either.
Apprehensive sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm struck by the fact that somebody described sailing as being 90% boredom and 10% terror. And I think a lot of sailors who sail on a small scale find it so. But you talk about the peace and tranquility of an ocean crossing, Annie.
Oh, absolutely, yes. There are few things more satisfying, really, than dropping the land astern and knowing that you have 3 or 4 weeks before you see any land again, and there you are in your own little floating world, and it's wonderful.
And what are you going to do for 3 or 4 weeks?
Well, I did a lot of reading,
yes,
which is good. Usually do quite a lot of cooking too, which is also fun.
And the vessel needs sailing and maintenance.
But not much often if you're on a trade wind crossing.
On a trade wind crossing, but
yeah, that's what I was thinking of. I mean, that's the.
But for a normal crossing, I know people say, "What do you do?" Well, I said, "Well, it took 6 years to flog a 30-footer around a 10-mile course in the bay on a Wednesday afternoon," and you're wondering what one bloke did to. And none of you did any cooking or maintenance while you're at it either.
Well, it's often struck me that you spend an afternoon or a day or whatever on a boat, particularly if you're on watch, and you don't seem to do anything. You are constantly occupied. Your mind is constantly busy, and at the end of the shift, you look back on it and you cannot tell why you felt that way, because in a sense nothing happened and you didn't do anything. But you were very happy all the time.
Isn't it wonderful? I mean, you say you go to sea for a month and you can be lazy without feeling guilty. Because there's nothing you can, you're actually sailing the boat. So you're being a busy bee, just sailing the boat.
Well, there is an attentiveness factor in this, isn't there? That every day you've got to be paying attention to all the little tiny things that make a boat go together.
Yes. Do not ignore new noises.
That's right.
Yes.
They won't go away.
I've also heard sailors say that the real say that for people for whom sailing is a serious part of their lives, they love the sea and they love the land, and they love each of them more because they have because they have the two of them.
Oh yes, the one makes you appreciate the other. And I grew up in a fairly hilly part of the world and used to hate the sight of marshlands. But I found that after I'd been living on a boat for a long time, I actually really love marshlands now. And I love that long horizon because I've got so used to it. Whereas most people, their horizon's never more than a few hundred yards away.
It occurred to me that Annie had gone through her whole experience with Badger and had developed her whole philosophy and way of looking at things and had written the book, I guess, while you were still together with Pete and Badger.
That's right, yes.
And then that separation occurs, and then you meet Trevor, but it seems to me that Trevor has quite independently developed almost exactly the same approach to living his life. Is that a fair description?
Yes.
Yeah, well, when we met, he said he'd never bothered to read my book because he didn't think he was going to learn much from it. He was already doing it. Thank you very much.
and it was $22.
And one of the lessons of the book is frugality.
That's right.
Absolutely.
I did point out he could have borrowed it from the library.
Or found it used.
Or found it used. Yeah.
Great. So it is, but it is essentially the same thing. Only let me just ask you this little bit, which is you've had a slightly different approach to it. In a way, you've been able to live a life of retirement for 11 months on the proceeds of working for 1 month. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how that's worked.
Once you're afloat and have cut your ties to the shore, your cost of living is quite a small proportion of what it would be if you were trying to maintain a house and a car and utilities and cell phone and all the rest of the paraphernalia. So that it's relatively easy if you can find a suitable work to live off a lot less than a year's for a lot longer than a year on a year's wages. And with this modern move to contract out services, they tend to pay contractors quite a lot of money for working intensely for short periods, and that's what I've done. And it's fitted in very well with the sailing lifestyle, and it gets easier and easier every year, I believe. Because there's more and more services are contracted out from the core of the parent company, and so there's more and more work for short-term contractors with specialist skills for short periods of time. So you don't have to sign on the line, for 30 years.
Well, you're not even expected to have any loyalty to the company.
No, you're paid to do a job and do it well, and thank you and you're paid quite well for it. And as soon as you've finished, thank you very much. Get out of here. Yeah. And there's plenty. Obviously, there's a huge amount of work like that in the computing fields. I'm in fact a geologist, and I was working on oil rigs as a contract geologist, but there's a huge amount of it in almost any field. I mean, essentially, that's what you're doing.
Yes, it is. Yes,
Yeah.
it is. Yeah.
CBC does not employ you on a full-time basis.
Nobody does.
Nobody does.
No,
Yeah.
no, that's right.
No pension plan, but
except what you create for yourself.
you got what you create your own
Which,
pension plan.
of course, Annie did quite successfully before she was 30.
That's right, yes.
I guess that's the other one. Another one that a lot of people would be anxious about, though, would be issues like insurance and health insurance. Do you carry insurance on the boat?
No. Essentially, well, we regard it as an uninsurable risk. I believe is a phrase. The other thing is, well, I was just talking to someone who is eminently not an uninsurable risk. You know, been insured with the same company for 20 years, and they just wrote him a letter saying, "Sorry, we're no longer insuring vessels worth less than $1 million."
Puts you in your place, isn't it?
Yeah.
But
he said,
even
"I'm not willing to upgrade quite that far."
But I mean, occasionally you do hear of people who do manage to get insured for the sort of thing that we're doing. It would probably cost
15.
considerably more than we're living on just to insure the boat.
Yes.
So I mean,
Or 15%, 20% per annum of the vessels. Well, if you reckon you're going to wreck it in 5 years, I suppose it's a good bet.
yeah, but
Other than that, you're better off self-insuring.
if you're that bad a sailor, perhaps you shouldn't be out there.
Well, I've lost one vessel, but
Well, yeah, but in how many years of sailing?
Yeah, close on 40.
Yeah, so
It's much cheaper, as always, to self-insure if you can.
and it's a healthy lifestyle. So
Yeah.
and you know, 95% of the world don't have health insurance and manage.
Yeah.
So
Don't
why
get
should
sick
you be
in the
any
United
different?
States.
Yes.
Yeah, that's if you get sick in the United States, sail from there immediately. But
Somewhere a little more civilised.
What happens if you get sick in a third world country?
Don't.
Well, actually, there is always medical assistance available for a price.
Well, the thing is that, I mean, sickness. I mean, most people recover from an illness. The medicos don't actually do much to help. And if you're really healthy, you don't get sick very easily. I mean, most of the things that people are worrying about in the Western world are the diseases of affluence anyway. So if you're not affluent, you're not likely to get them, are you?
This has never troubled us.
And it's irrational to worry about being sick if you've never been sick.
Obviously, there's the accident issue.
Yes.
But most people who need medevacing from Bali, for instance, have fallen off a motorbike without a helmet and that sort of thing, whilst generally after drinking a few beers.
And if you have an accident, well, you have an accident. But I mean, because you're living as we are living, you've got capital. So you do have money to cover costs.
I have enough money to cover
anything other than some chronic degenerative illness, in which case I just top him over the head and stick him over the side.
I don't pay taxes. Why should so I can afford to pay for my medical.
Yes. It's only your medical care you need to worry about, not everybody else's.
Yes, that's right. And I'm reasonably healthy, so it's actually probably a lot cheaper than.
Yes, and if you were to lose the boat, you could replace it.
Yes, exactly.
It's not catastrophic.
No, and
I'd be quite upset for a week or two. But, it wouldn't be then.
But that is.
Sting, but it wouldn't be the end.
Yeah,
and we'd have another boat in
short order.
Fairly quick time.
But that's one of the problems with people who overcommit on their boats, is they then have to insure the boat because
they can't afford to lose $500,000.
But I mean, that's ridiculous.
And this vessel probably does as much and as easily as as many vessels that have more money spent on the electronics than we have on the entire vessel.
Great, let's go and look at the vessel. Thank you so much. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is, you built this boat and crossed oceans in it long before you met Annie.
Yes.
Why this boat? What prompted you to build this particular design?
Fairly cheap, fairly simple to build, good carrying capacity, cheap and cheerful. And she's proved all of those things. She's not an expensive vessel, not a difficult vessel to maintain, very tough, and huge carrying capacity. And Annie and I, with no more clutter than you can see now, have headed off to Greenland with provisions for 500 days for 2 people, and you could see no more of it than you can now.
That's interesting. The carrying capacity would be so high on your list, though.
It's quite useful.
Yeah, you've got to have that, don't you?
Yeah.
You've got to have room enough for.
We've got aboard right now. We've got all the tools that we use to make the boat, including the welders and.
And why steel?
Relatively strong and relatively cheap. It's not. It has its problems, but so does everything else.
Yeah, the problems being corrosion.
Corrosion,
yeah,
particularly inside.
Yes, inside.
Yeah, the outside's easy to get at. The inside is not.
Yes.
The reason you can see all the screw heads, if you look around, is that the interior comes apart like a kit of parts.
Okay. So
that you can get at the hull if
hull.
required to chip and paint.
And how much of that do you have to do on the inside?
I did a big job. I spent a couple of months doing it some years ago. So probably every 10 years you need to put aside a chunk of time to do it. Particularly if you've been in a cold climate. I think what happens is you get cold spots where the ribs expand at a different rate to the hull plating, and the paint breaks away because it's not on at the join. It is in the high latitudes where the inside of the boat's +5 or something, and the outside's -40.
Did you have to coat it and did you coat it with something on the inside other than paint when you just paint? Because some people do, don't they?
Yes, in Canada it's very common to spray polyurethane foam insulation inside. The problem there is if you need to do any repairs, you have to remove it all because the stuff is flammable, at least at the temperatures that welding produces.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah. So considering the boat as a home rather than because in a way you're considering it as a freighter when you talk about carrying capacity, right? It has to be. It has to carry everything you would need for 30, 60, 80 days. But considering as a home, what particular features work and don't work from your? What are you particularly fond of or not fond of?
Fairly open. The feeling of space is quite useful. Probably gained partly by having cabin sides going right out the side of the vessel. White, not a lot of it's not an all teak interior. The white gives it a bit of feeling of space, and not too many berths. There's basically only 4 berths in this boat, and many 35-footers that have 6 or 7. Someone said the perfect boat sleeps 4, eats 8, drinks 10.
Yeah. yes.
Or something. Put up whatever numbers you like.
That's right. Well, you could drink a lot of people.
Oh,
on
you
this
can
boat
drink a lot. Yes.
And the galley is a very generous space also.
Yes. Lots of counter space and plenty of places to hang on.
Not actually a whole lot less than you would have in a small house.
No.
And heat is by
wood or oil. That heater there, it's very much a homemade affair, there's a break in the chimney with a quick disconnect, and I can whip that heater out, and it takes 45 minutes and bolt an oil-fired heater in its place, and I'd be back to being oil-fired in treacles now if I needed to. It's stowed up forward.
So you carry the 2 heaters?
Yep. I've just come from Chile. Plenty of firewood in Chile, no diesel. If I go back to Greenland, whip that out. If it was just a summer trip, I'd probably take a couple of sacks of charcoal. But if for a long trip, I'd whip that out and replace it with the diesel heater.
Tell me a little bit about electricity, because really there are some things like the computer and the GPS that do have to have electricity. I see a solar panel on the top of the hatch going here.
Yep. That'll keep up with everything. Ever since they invented LEDs for interior lighting, that'll keep up with everything except the computer. The computer's it's an old computer and it's pretty hungry. And if I use a computer, I'm going to have to generate electricity some other way, and the only other way is from an alternator on the main engine, which is very inefficient, but I'm not about to carry another engine around just to charge batteries.
No. But so the sources are the solar panel and the main engine.
And the main engine. Main engine isn't particularly big, but 16 or 18 horsepower. In fact, it's about the size that most boats carry, as their Jen said.
Yes. That's not a lot of horsepower for a boat as big and substantial as this one.
No, it's a bit light on sometimes. This can be a nuisance.
Yeah, but it moves the boat along. And
It moves the boat. And
you're not setting out to be a motorboat anyway.
no, there are a couple of times I've regretted not having a larger engine. It blowing very hard, anchor being to drag. You only want to move 50 yards, but you want to move 50 yards directly into a hurricane force wind, and there's no substitute for brute horsepower at this point with a big propeller. But we haven't lost the boat from it yet. It's been a close run thing once or twice.
Well, one of the merits of steel, and I think you remarked on this the other day in a conversation, was if you do get blown ashore, the boat may be damaged, but it's very unlikely to be broken.
Yes.
They
They dent rather than splinter or shatter or whatever. So with an ounce of luck you'll be able to pull her off.
Yes, yes. And she may look a little wrinkled, but and you can pound that out to some extent, I guess.
Or you simply ignore it until it suits you.
Yes.
And that may be several years down the track.
Yes, that's right. And then at some point you're ashore and you say, well, I could fix that now.
Yeah, I really should do something about that great big dent on the bow where I hit.
Annie Hill and Trevor Robertson, nautical nomads and philosophers of frugality. If you enjoyed this interview, you might like to look at our interview with Satish Kumar, editor of Resurgence magazine and another advocate of radical simplicity, or the interview with Bill Rees, the father of ecological footprint analysis. For The Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. Thanks for watching.